Amelia Adams, thank you so much for joining us from Los Angeles. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks, Matt. It's a crazy time to be here, and we actually only moved to America for this job, for my job, 2 months ago. So we really moved at a very interesting time.
Yeah, the last time I saw you, we were in London and we were looking forward to beers and barbecues back in the Australian summer. And the next thing you're on a plane to Los Angeles. So you were the European correspondent for Channel 9 when we met a couple of years ago. And now all of a sudden in a bit of a whirlwind, you're now the US correspondent in Los Angeles. Tell us about that crazy journey.
Yeah, that was a bit of an unexpected curveball. So we were sort of packing up from London and heading home, but then this opportunity came up, which was fantastic. So we moved to Los Angeles in middle of January, and with two small kids, and did all the house hunting and all of those things, got settled, and I started in Nine's bureau here. And literally within weeks, this coronavirus story kind of took off, and it escalated so quickly. And I know it did in Australia as well, but we're certainly a few weeks, if not a month or so, ahead of you guys. California actually was the first American state to be put under a full mandatory stay-at-home order in March. So we'd only been in this house. I mean, our furniture still hasn't arrived, so we hadn't even unpacked our suitcases. And suddenly our lives, as everyone else's did, shifted. The schools closed. So our son had just started this new school, which was a big transition from school in London, thinking he was going to Australia, coming to America, a different year, no uniform, all the things he had to adapt to. Preschool closed as well. And then the fact that we really were told not to leave our homes at all, except for essentials. And that's been going on we're in our fourth week now of the full stay-at-home order. So it's getting tiring.
Well, you obviously have, essential work to do in other parts of America. So obviously hats off to Luke, your husband, who is, carrying the burden of being the stay-at-home parent. But how have you found that, having to head over to the East Coast and traveling around during this crisis?
Yeah, it was really interesting. Early on, we were sort of chasing the story in the sense that anywhere there was a cluster, in fact, in Aspen, Colorado, there was the biggest cluster of coronavirus anywhere in the States back in March, and that was a cluster of Australians. There are about 20-odd Australians from Melbourne, friends who went to a drinks party together after skiing, and then one of the younger members of the group flew home to Melbourne, got very sick and tested positive for COVID, and told all the rest of the crew back in Aspen, hey, just so you know, I've tested positive. And sure enough, about 13 of them who were still on their big skiing holiday then tested. So when this broke, we scrambled from here and we flew there, and we're chasing these Australians and in the hotel. So this is just before any of the social distancing came in. You're shaking your hands and you're tracking people down and whatnot. We would literally follow clusters wherever they were, because that was the story. The same when there was a cruise ship in San Francisco, my colleague went, to try and find Australians and whatnot. Then suddenly it was the case of, we're being told not to travel. So how do we manage that in our job? Obviously, we still need to. So 2 weeks ago, I went to Washington, DC, because President Trump started his daily coronavirus task force briefings, and obviously that was a big element of the story was and continues to be in DC. I've never seen anything like LAX, and that was 2 weeks ago. Absolutely deserted. There was no queues through security, nothing. It was like you really felt like you shouldn't be there. No shops were open. There were about 5 people on my flight. Every second flight was cancelled. It's very hard to get anywhere here domestically. And there were about 5 people on my flight. They're all scrambling to get home for their families, because everyone's so worried that domestic travel will stop. And the president keeps sort of mentioning that, flagging that. And there was I voluntarily flying to the other side of the country to be away from my family to work. So it's a really unusual situation. And the same coming back, deserted again, even harder to fly. And again, there is a concern that domestic travel may stop, but look, all the evidence here shows that what the American government's doing is working in terms of those shutdown measures and social distancing. And in fact, just a few hours ago, they've revised down the projected death toll. So we can only keep doing what we're told. And for myself, when I do have to travel and get out amongst it, just take as many precautions as I can.
Well, that's good news because given what's happened in Europe and parts of Asia, and I think the attitude in Australia is fairly, people are concerned, but also taking proper precautions. But I don't think anyone's too panicked about it. There's not even a feeling that anyone expects they're going to get sick. I think everyone's just doing what they have to do for the sake of the community. But what's the feeling like in America, where obviously it's been a whole different level of outbreak?
It has. I think there was a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear. Initially, it was actually San Francisco that was put into stay-at-home order. That was 7 million. Then within days, you're talking 40 million people across California. You tell 40 million people to stay at home and only go out for groceries. And that was just a nightmare. Suddenly everyone thinks that they're never going to eat again. So the grocery shopping, and I know you've seen similar things there, but even now, even today, I have to drive around to several stores. The queues are around the block because everyone is social distance and every store is only letting a very limited amount of people in. So it's still very hard to shop here. And I think that does induce anxiety when you're worried that you can't feed your family, even though there's nothing wrong with the supply chain. I think another thing causing anxiety is probably the White House, because the president does give mixed messaging. And this is, I'm not having a crack at the Trump administration. I think no other US administration in history has had to deal with this, but it is just a fact that he has given some very confusing messages. He will foreshadow a major announcement and then sort of backpedal, or he will announce something that he obviously wasn't supposed to, and someone will come up on the podium and clarify or slightly change the dialogue. So that's been really challenging as a journalist. But also I think just as, someone who lives in America, I've got a family here, and we're all just doing the best to do with the information that we're given, and that information has not always been clear. But I think it's shifted. I think it has shifted in the last week, definitely, in terms of the president heeding medical advice and talking more to the science. And that's evident in the fact that he has, extended the lockdown measures and indicated that saving lives comes first.
Well, you mentioned that, queues around the corners for shops. But I also saw a tweet from you that showed queues for gun shops around the corner. I mean, how does that make you feel as an Australian in America?
Yeah, that was unnerving. I mean, that was a real moment where, we heard that the gun shops were suddenly seeing the same sorts of queues, and I thought, what? Why would you race out? And then you sort of get that feeling in your stomach like, oh my goodness, people think they need to arm themselves. They think that there's going to be civil unrest. They think that if people start robbing each other's homes or breaking in to steal toilet paper or whatever it is we can't get our hands on that week, they're going to pull out their gun. And that was scary for me. And we went down there for the Today Show, and sure enough, there had been people queuing for hours around the corner. And what I found really interesting was when I spoke to people, I expected those people to be people with gun licenses or stocking up on ammo, and most of the people I spoke to had never had a firearm. They didn't want one. They just applied for a license, and they felt that now is the time. A couple of people said everyone else is getting one now, which I never think is a good reason, but mostly it was just that sense of, we don't know what's going to happen. We're scared. LA has seen very violent riots before. We'd rather be armed.
It's a different world. We find it hard to imagine. But I'm sure, speaking of hard to imagine, when you took this gig, I mean, no one knew that this virus was going to burst onto the scene. But what sort of stories were you anticipating covering during your time in America?
Yeah, it's been remarkable. I mean, I landed just before the Iowa caucuses, so it was good timing. It was like, right, election year is kicking off, and obviously I felt that would be the focus of 2020 very much. And so getting my head around shifting from Brexit to the US political system, the caucuses, which are kind of crazy in many ways, and the primaries, and following the Democratic candidates dropping off one by one. And then, suddenly the election that was wall-to-wall coverage here. You put on any network at any time of the day and they are talking about November, presidential election, 2020, the race for the White House. It's just huge here. I can't stress that enough. And then suddenly that just went right into the background, quite rightly, has been knocked out of the headlines. There's been a lot of things that have been impacted in terms of states having to delay and postpone their primaries. And then even today, just a few hours ago, Bernie Sanders dropping out of the race because he said, it's just impossible to keep going under the circumstances. So the campaign is still very much running. And, when those stories break, certainly it does make the headlines, but it's been a very, very different few months to what I expected. You're right. And I haven't seen a red carpet, I can tell you that much. So in fact, I stood outside the Dolby Theatre on Hollywood Boulevard where the Oscars are held in my boots and my big duffel coat. And I did my first LA live cross in the middle of the night about the fact that there was absolutely nobody here because everyone had been told to stay inside. And I did not expect that to be my first, middle of Hollywood live cross to 9 News.
Well, you've covered major stories from terrorist attacks to gun violence to, all manner of things, Brexit in the UK. Did you ever think you'd be covering a story quite like this one that reflects this situation with the world locked down and something that's so global? Did that ever cross your mind that you'd be reporting on something like this?
It really didn't, because having worked for so long, obviously in Australia, but then in Europe, it ebbs and flows. If we have a big story here, we could be the lead story in the States for a couple of days, but then something huge will happen in Australia politically, or something with the royal family, and Europe will take the lead. And that's just the way the news cycle works. But to have a story where everywhere in the world, and it has gone in stages, obviously, because you had China, then you had Italy, so Europe was the story for a while. The US has now overtaken every other country in the world. We've got more than 400,000 cases, I think, as of today. Of coronavirus, but to have a story where every country has got so much we have so much information to give, and so many incredible pictures of our cities here, like New York, Times Square, and then even Hollywood Boulevard and all your iconic theatres absolutely empty. When do you ever see that in history? The freeways here, but then at the same time, Australia started to catch up and started to escalate, and suddenly your not governors, premiers, your state premiers are putting in place your own lockdown. So then we're sort of getting bumped down the news bulletins. So it's been very interesting in terms of how do we cover it when there's so much news out of every corner of the world every single day.
And on a personal level, how are you going? Home with 2 little kids, and and your husband, and new country. How's the lockdown situation going as a family?
Yeah, look, it is hard. It's harder for my husband because we'd just gotten here and we're on a much better time zone and much better climate than Europe. So we're looking forward to this new chapter. And he was going to be finding a job and doing his thing. So he's had to put all that on hold. He's doing an amazing job homeschooling. Plus we've got a little 3-year-old who's, as all 3-year-olds are, not easy. But we've done some lovely things as a family as well. We had, on the first weekend of lockdown, we planned our first ever camping trip to a national park here. And they closed all the national parks. So we set up our big family tent in the living room, and we got a little table and some camp chairs, and we put a candle there and said it was a campfire. We got marshmallows, and him and I opened a beer, and we said, this is it. We're having our camping weekend, in the living room. And we've spent some really good quality time. It's been very difficult for him when I have been away traveling for the story, because not only is he not able to leave the house, but he has the added concern of what I'm doing, and then I'm coming through airports, and am I going to be transmitting this virus with me? So I think that's stressful, and I think also we don't know, and nobody knows when it's going to end. And you asked me before about how it compares to other stories. Never before have I covered a story where I would be away for more than 2.5 weeks maximum. For a news story to have that continued appetite for our viewers and to be keeping on evolving and developing for more than 2 weeks is a long time. And usually with a natural disaster or a crisis or a terror attack or any sort of death or anything, it will naturally, you'll have the disaster, and then you'll have vigils, and then you'll have people coming together and healing, and then you'll fly home. And, that story moves on. And that is just not happening yet. And we don't know when it will happen. We may have crews in New York City and Washington, D.C. for many months to come. So we're just rotating. I'm coming back, catching my breath, spending some time with the family, washing my clothes, and then I'll probably head off again. And that's all we can do. I think it's just make sure we're looking after each other when we're here and when we're on the road.
Well, it's well said. I think it's the uncertainty that's getting to everyone. But something I want to do is that we're establishing on the show a show and tell section. So I know that you don't have most of your stuff because it's still en route from London. But do you have something there that's significant, that's helping you get through lockdown, that tells a story of its own?
I do. I have very few props, as you mentioned. A lot of it is still on the ship, but I do have my trusty press helmet, which I brought with me in the suitcase. And this originated from, I got this in Paris in December 2018 for the riots, if you remember the yellow vest riots. And off we went to Paris, and it was probably, they've been protesting for weeks and weeks by the time we got there, and they had said this is the week that we're gonna burn Paris, basically. And they did. So we got there in the morning when we realised the scale of how dangerous it was going to be and what was planned for that city. My fixer said we have to go straight to, he took us to some little back alley, round a corner and down a dark, dingy tunnel to this man that fitted us out in our helmets, and I got gas mask and all sorts of things. And this copped a few hits from tear gas canisters and all sorts of projectiles. And then I took it to Israel as well, to the Gaza Strip, because I needed to be out filming when we were in view of snipers, so I had to wear that. And most recently came with me to Iraq in October 2019 when the conflict broke out between Syria and Turkey, and we were heading up to the border to Syria and sort of planning to cross, so fully kitted out. So that's my trusty helmet. My kids like to wear it around the house sometimes, but that's my show and tell. That's really all I've got.
I'm really in two minds about it because it tells some amazing stories, but also any of the time that you have to wear head protection indicates that you're in a bit of a tough spot. So I hope you don't have to wear it that often in the coming days, especially since you're now in the US. Let's hope things don't deteriorate where that'll become a requirement.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for sharing it with us. It's been great. It's such an extraordinary situation for everyone, and thank you for giving us an insight into your little world there and the great job you're doing on bringing this story to the rest of us.
Oh, thanks. It is interesting, and like I said, I think there'll be no red carpets, and there'll be no. Well, look, actually, the presidential election will happen. That will happen at the end of the year. But it's going to be a very different election, unlike any other, I think, US election in history. It already is. They've held elections during wars here, but never during a global pandemic when people can't physically stand close enough to each other to vote. So there's a whole lot of reshuffling going on in the background to do with that right now. The Democratic convention's already been delayed. Now we know who the race is against as of today, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But it's going to be a very, very interesting year. I'll keep you updated.
Well, good luck covering it, and stay safe and well. I hope that things don't get any worse in the US and obviously in Australia as well. But hopefully at some stage I'll make it over to LA when we're allowed to travel again, and we'll catch up for an overdue glass of wine. But
long overdue.
Thank you for your time. It's been great. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll talk again.
Thanks, Matt. Take care.